on a boat in the middle of the sea during a storm would likely have to be high up on the list of things I would actively try to avoid, especially if we're talking about the type of boats that Jesus and his disciples had in their day. So when Jesus turns to his disciples after calming the storm and asks them, "Why are you terrified?" it might sound a bit strange. We might think that if we were on the boat, we would reply with something like, "Well, Jesus, of course we were afraid. We were on a boat in the middle of the sea during a storm." But if Jesus's question seems to confuse us, or maybe even upset us, then perhaps we're not hearing him correctly. Because Jesus is not saying to his disciples, "Stop being so soft, it's just a little storm." Nor is he saying, "Maybe if you tried a bit harder to have faith in me, you wouldn't be so afraid." No. Instead, Jesus is correcting their focus. If our focus is on how much water is coming in the boat, or on how high the waves are rising, or how fast the wind is blowing, then of course we'll be afraid, because our focus will only be on the storm. During the storms of life, more often than not, we are simply at the mercy of the waves and the wind. But we always have control of one thing, and that is what, or rather who, we reach out to in the midst of the storms. What the disciples experienced physically on that day, we experience spiritually all the time. So what are the storms that we face in our lives? I think it's important to recognize that not all storms are equal. Some storms will simply pass with time. They exist only for a moment and then they fade. Maybe it takes a few days or a few weeks or a few months, but ultimately they'll blow over. But some storms are far stronger. They seem to linger around for years. And I'm sure many of you could name the particular storms that you've been caught in the midst of for what seems like forever. Some of you may even feel like you've been in a storm your entire life. Some storms, the Lord stirs up himself so that he can get our attention. Like the first reading we heard from the book of Job, there are some storms that the Lord calls out to us from. In all of these, though, the question stands: to what extent do we cry out to the Lord in the midst of the storms? When storms begin to arise at work or at school or in the home, when storms are brewing between me and my spouse or my children or my relatives or my friends, what do we do? Do we reach out for the Lord? Do we act like the disciples today and try and shout to him to wake him up? Or are we paralyzed with fear at the storm in front of us, and so we end up doing nothing? See, the more we cry out to the Lord, the more we lean on him, even as our boat seems to rock and shake, and even as it seems to fill with water, the better we will ultimately become at sailing through the storms of life. Because surrendering ourselves to the Lord is a spiritual skill we have to grow in. It's not something that just magically appears one day. But relying on the Lord in the midst of the storms, and crying out to him time and again can honestly be very exhausting. Sometimes we may feel like we've been crying out to the Lord for most of our lives, for peace in the midst of the storms that surround us. But we must remember the end of a storm is not the only way to receive peace. The end of a storm is not the only way to receive peace. Because the point of this gospel is not to say that Jesus is going to calm every single one of our storms if only we have enough faith. Rather, the point of the gospel is to show us that we can turn to Christ to find peace even in the midst of the storms, but only if we shift our focus to Him, only if we turn our gaze towards Christ. Because there is no storm strong enough to destroy the peace that Christ can give us. At the seminary, we're blessed to live on a beautiful lake right on campus. And on this lake is a large boathouse, and it's filled with all sorts of kayaks and many of these one-person sunfish sailboats. I'm not sure if you've ever seen these before. But I always loved seeing someone take the sailboat out on the lake. It's really beautiful to see. But unfortunately, I would say most of the seminarians, myself included, have no idea how to operate one of these sailboats. But there's one seminarian who loves to sail, knows how to sail very well, and loves to teach others how to sail. And one thing that struck me as I talked to him was that he told me whenever he takes someone out sailing for the first time and teaches them how to operate one of these small sailboats, he purposefully has them flip the sailboat and fall into the water. Well, the reasoning behind this is because getting the boat back right side up is an important skill to have. And it's better to learn how to do it when relying on someone else for help than to try and figure out how to do it the first time you flip by yourself. Though today's gospel is about storms, at the end of the day, I don't really think that it's storms we're most afraid of. I'll admit, some storms can be scarier than others. And for some of us, we feel like we're in the midst of storms that have no end. But even still, it's not always the storm itself that we fear. What does cause us great fear, though, is what happens if the boat we're in capsizes and we fall into the water. I think if we're honest, spiritually speaking, many of us have never learned how to get back into the boat after we've fallen off. And I'm sure many of you have seen friends or family fall off the boat and never seem to get back on board. And maybe some of you here right now feel like you are drowning in the sea as we speak. Even though falling off the boat and being tossed about in the waves may feel like the most helpless place possible, the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Because sometimes the solution, whether we're in a shaky boat or in the midst of the waves of the sea, the solution is so simple, yet we'll spend our entire lives mastering it. Jesus shows us the answer today. All we need to do is fix our gaze on Christ, whom even the wind and the sea obey. Brothers and sisters, The Lord does not need much from us at all. Cry out to him, reach out to him, even simply turn your gaze toward him, so that even in the midst of the storms, he may fill you with his peace.